The night air was crisp as Officer James Reeves drove his patrol car through the quiet streets of Oakwood. The town usually settled down after 10, with only the occasional teenager out past curfew or a tired worker heading home from a late shift. James had been on the force for just under 3 years now, and these night patrols had become as familiar to him as his morning coffee routine. He took a sip from his thermos and glanced at the dashboard clock. 11:42 p.m. Just a few more hours until his shift ended. The radio crackled occasionally with updates from dispatch, but nothing major had happened all week. Small towns had their perks. As James approached the intersection of Maple and Fifth, the traffic light turned red. He slowed to a stop and drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, looking around at the empty streets. That's when he saw it, a silver BMW approaching the same intersection from the perpendicular road. The car wasn't slowing down. James watched as the BMW blew straight through the red light. No hesitation, not even a tap on the brakes. He put down his thermos, flipped on his lights and siren, and pulled out to follow the car. The BMW continued for another block before finally pulling over to the curb, tires screeching slightly as it came to an abrupt stop. James called in the license plate and his location to dispatch before stepping out of his cruiser. Standard procedure, especially at this hour. As he approached the driver's side window, he noticed the car weaving slightly within the lane. The window rolled down in jerky movements, and the smell hit him immediately. The unmistakable odor of alcohol mixed with expensive perfume. "Good evening, ma'am." "License and registration, please," James said, shining his flashlight briefly into the car. The young woman behind the wheel squinted against the light. She was well-dressed, probably in her early 20s, with long brown hair and what would have been a pretty face if it wasn't twisted into a scowl. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" James asked, keeping his tone professional. "No idea," she slurred, fumbling with her purse. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." James watched as she struggled to find her wallet. "You ran a red light back at Maple and Fifth. Have you had anything to drink tonight?" The woman's movements stilled for a moment before she let out a laugh that didn't sound amused at all. "Just one glass of wine with dinner. Hours ago." Her words ran together, contradicting her claim. "I'm going to need your license and registration," James repeated patiently. After more fumbling, she handed over a driver's license identifying her as Sophia Mitchell, age 22. The registration in the glove compartment matched the vehicle. "Step out of the car, please, Ms. Mitchell," James said, his suspicions confirmed by her unsteady movements and the smell of alcohol. "What? Why?" "I told you I just had one glass," she protested, but reluctantly opened the door. As she stepped out, she stumbled slightly, grabbing the car door for support. James had seen this scene play out hundreds of times before. "I'm going to ask you to perform a few simple tests," James explained, guiding her to a flat section of sidewalk away from the road. "This is ridiculous," Sophia muttered, but followed him unsteadily. "Do you know who my father is?" James had heard this line too many times to count. "Ma'am, I need you to focus on the tasks I'm asking you to perform." He went through the standard field sobriety test, walking in a straight line, following his finger with her eyes, standing on one leg. Sophia failed each one spectacularly, swaying and stumbling her way through the tests. "Ms. Mitchell, based on my observations, I believe you're intoxicated. I'm placing you under arrest for driving under the influence." That's when Sophia's attitude changed completely. Her face flushed with anger, and she jabbed a finger toward his chest. "My father is Special Agent Mitchell with the FBI," she said, her voice rising. "You're making a huge mistake. He's going to have your badge for this." James had heard similar threats before. People claimed to know judges, mayors, chiefs of police, anyone who might scare an officer into letting them go. He simply took out his handcuffs. "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back," he said calmly. "You're not listening to me." Sophia's voice cracked with frustration. "Call my father. Right now. Special Agent Thomas Mitchell, FBI Field Office." James proceeded with the arrest, reading Sophia her rights as she continued to protest. He helped her into the back of his patrol car, wondering if there was any truth to her claim. It didn't matter either way. Drunk driving was drunk driving, regardless of who your father was. As James got back into the driver's seat, he had no idea that his by-the-book arrest was about to turn his quiet life in Oakwood completely upside down. The fluorescent lights of the Oakwood police station buzzed overhead as Officer James Reeves finished typing up his arrest report. The clock on the wall read 1:17 a.m. The station was quiet except for the occasional ring of a phone and the soft conversation between the two other officers on night duty. "Drunk college kid?" asked Officer Pete Wilson, glancing at the holding cell where Sophia Mitchell sat with her head in her hands. "Yeah," James replied, not looking up from his computer. "Caught her running a red light on Maple. Blew a 0.14 on the breathalyzer." "Rich kid by the looks of that car," Pete remarked. "Those are always fun. They think daddy's money can make everything go away." James just nodded. He'd already heard enough of Sophia's claims about her FBI agent father to last him a lifetime. During the drive to the station, she'd alternated between angry threats and tearful pleas, all centered around her father's supposed authority. Sergeant Mike Davis walked in from the break room, coffee in hand. "How's our guest doing?" he asked with a nod toward the holding cell. "Claims her dad's an FBI agent," James said with a slight eye roll. "Apparently, we're all going to be working traffic duty in Alaska by next week." The sergeant chuckled. "Never heard that one before." His sarcasm was thick as he settled behind the front desk. Just then, the station phone rang. Sergeant Davis picked it up casually. "Oakwood Police Department, Sergeant Davis speaking." James continued typing, only half listening to the sergeant's side of the conversation. "Yes, sir, I understand, but yes, we do have a Sophia Mitchell in custody, driving under the influence." Something in Davis's tone changed, causing James to look up. The surgeon's posture had stiffened, and the casual smile was gone from his face. "I see, sir. Yes, I understand the protocol for verification. If you could provide your badge number and the authentication code, I can." Davis was writing something down, his expression growing increasingly serious. James watched as Davis typed something into his computer, then sat up straighter in his chair. "Yes, Agent Mitchell, I verified your credentials." "Yes, sir. She's being held here at the station." "Yes, sir." "I understand you driving in. Approximately 2 hours, you said." A cold feeling settled in James's stomach. He turned back to his computer screen, suddenly very interested in making sure every detail of his report was perfect. After hanging up, Sergeant Davis walked over to James's desk. For a few long seconds, he just stood there. "That was Special Agent Thomas Mitchell," Davis finally said, his voice unusually formal. "FBI field office in the city. Sophia Mitchell is his daughter." James felt his mouth go dry. She was telling the truth. "Apparently," Davis said, rubbing his forehead. "He's on his way. Should be here in about 2 hours." The news spread through the small station like wildfire. Within minutes, the other officers were finding reasons to pass by James's desk, offering looks that ranged from sympathy to amusement. "What did he sound like?" Officer Jenny Torres asked the sergeant just loud enough for James to hear. "Like someone you don't want to mess with," Davis replied grimly. "He recited verification codes I didn't even know existed." James tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept returning to all the things Sophia had said during the arrest. How her father would have his badge. How his career would be over. How he picked the wrong person to mess with. He glanced at the holding cell, where Sophia now sat with a smug expression, watching the officers' reactions to the news of her father's call. "I'd followed procedure," James said, more to himself than anyone else. She was clearly intoxicated. "I did everything by the book." "Nobody's saying you didn't, kid," Davis said, not unkindly. "But FBI connections, that complicates things." The next hour dragged by painfully slow. James finished his report, then double-checked it, then triple-checked it. He reviewed the body camera footage of the arrest, making sure there was nothing that could be misconstrued. Every time the front door opened, he tensed, expecting to see an angry federal agent storming in. By the time the station clock hit 3:00 a.m., the atmosphere had become unbearably tense. "Maybe you should take an early lunch," Officer Torres suggested, shooting him a sympathetic look. James shook his head. "No, I'm not hiding. I did my job." At 3:17 a.m., the front door of the station swung open. A tall man in a dark suit walked in, his presence immediately commanding attention. He didn't need to introduce himself. The badge clipped to his belt and the stern expression on his face said it all. Special Agent Thomas Mitchell had arrived, and every officer in the room knew that James Reeves's night was about to get a whole lot worse. Special Agent Thomas Mitchell stood in the doorway of the Oakwood Police Station, his presence instantly changing the atmosphere of the room. He wasn't particularly tall or muscular, but something about the way he carried himself made him seem larger than life. His dark suit was slightly wrinkled from the long drive, but his eyes were sharp and alert despite the late hour. Officer James Reeves swallowed hard. This was the moment he'd been dreading for the past 2 hours. His palms felt sweaty as he watched Sergeant Davis approach the FBI agent. "Agent Mitchell, I'm Sergeant Mike Davis. We spoke on the phone," Davis said, extending his hand. Mitchell shook it firmly. "Where's my daughter?" His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable authority that made even the veteran sergeant stand a little straighter. "She's in the holding cell, sir. She's fine," Davis assured him, gesturing toward the back of the station. "Would you like to see her first or—" "Not yet," Mitchell interrupted. "I want to speak with the arresting officer first." Every head in the room turned toward James, who felt his stomach drop. He stood up from his desk, straightening his uniform shirt. "That would be Officer Reeves, sir," Davis said, motioning toward James. Mitchell's eyes locked onto James, studying him for a long moment. "Officer Reeves, I'd like to review your arrest report and discuss the incident in detail. Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" James nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes, sir. We can use the conference room." As they walked to the small room at the back of the station, James felt like he was heading to his own execution. The other officers watched with a mix of concern and curiosity. Officer Torres gave him a subtle thumbs up of encouragement as he passed. The conference room was nothing special, just a rectangular table with 6 chairs, a whiteboard on one wall, and a coffee machine in the corner that had seen better days. James held the door open for Agent Mitchell, then closed it behind them. "Have a seat, officer," Mitchell said, placing his leather briefcase on the table. James sat down across from the agent, sliding his arrest report across the table. "Everything is documented here, sir. I followed standard procedure throughout the entire stop and arrest." Mitchell took the report but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and studied James's face. "Walk me through what happened, from the beginning." Taking a deep breath, James recounted the events of the night. The red light Sophia had run, her erratic driving, the smell of alcohol, the failed sobriety tests, and her belligerent behavior during the arrest. "She mentioned you right away," James added, "but I've heard similar claims before. People often say they have connections to try to avoid arrest." Mitchell nodded slightly. "And if you had known she was telling the truth, would you have handled things differently?" The question hung in the air between them. James thought carefully before answering. "No, sir, I wouldn't have," he said firmly. "The law applies equally to everyone. Your daughter was driving under the influence, endangering herself and others. My job was to get her off the road safely, regardless of who her father might be." Something flickered across Mitchell's face, surprise, perhaps, or possibly respect. He opened the arrest report and began reading it carefully, occasionally glancing up at James. The silence was unbearable. James could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the hum of the ancient coffee machine, and his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He resisted the urge to fill the silence with unnecessary explanations or apologies. After what felt like an eternity, Mitchell closed the report and placed it back on the table. "Your body camera footage, I'd like to see it," he said. "Of course," James replied, trying to sound confident despite his growing anxiety. "It's been uploaded to our system. I can have Sergeant Davis pull it up for you." Mitchell nodded. "Do that." James stepped out to speak with Davis, returning a few minutes later with a laptop showing the footage from his arrest. They watched in silence as the entire incident played out on screen. Sophia running the red light, her slurred speech, her failed sobriety tests, and her increasingly hostile behavior as James placed her under arrest. When the video ended, Mitchell closed the laptop slowly. His expression remained unreadable as he turned back to James. "Officer Reeves," he began, his tone impossible to interpret, "I have a few more questions about your interaction with my daughter." James straightened in his chair, bracing himself for what might come next. His career, his reputation, perhaps even his badge, all seemed to hang in the balance as he waited for the FBI agent's next words. The tension in the conference room was thick enough to cut with a knife. James sat across from Agent Mitchell, waiting for the questions that could end his career. His mouth felt dry, and he resisted the urge to loosen his collar. "Officer Reeves," Mitchell finally said, folding his hands on the table. "I want to know something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." James nodded, bracing himself. "Yes, sir." "If you could go back and do this all over again, knowing who my daughter is, what would you do differently?" It was the second time Mitchell had asked some version of this question. James thought carefully, knowing his answer mattered more than anything else he might say tonight. "With all due respect, sir, I wouldn't change a thing," he replied, looking Mitchell straight in the eye. "Your daughter was driving drunk. She could have killed someone or herself. My job is to protect everyone in this town, including her." Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but he held James's gaze for several long seconds before breaking into an unexpected smile. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say," he said, his tone warming. "Thank you, Officer Reeves." James blinked in confusion. "Sir?" "I appreciate your professionalism and your integrity," Mitchell explained, leaning back in his chair. "Too often, people in positions of authority expect special treatment. I've seen it throughout my career, rules bent, protocols ignored, all because someone flashes a badge or mentions the right name." James wasn't sure how to respond. This was the last reaction he expected from an FBI agent whose daughter was sitting in a holding cell. "You're not angry about the arrest?" he asked cautiously. Mitchell shook his head. "I'm furious about the situation, but not at you. You did your job exactly as you should have." He sighed deeply. "My daughter, on the other hand, needs to face the consequences of her actions." James was stunned. In his 3 years on the force, he dealt with plenty of angry parents who thought their children deserved special treatment. This was completely different. "I'd like to see Sophia now," Mitchell said, standing up. "Would you take me to her?" James led Mitchell through the station to the holding cell where Sophia was waiting. When she saw her father, she jumped up, her expression a mix of relief and triumph. "Dad, finally!" she exclaimed. "This officer arrested me for no reason. He wouldn't listen when I told him." "Stop!" Mitchell cut her off, his voice stern. "I've seen the report. I've watched the footage. Officer Reeves did his job properly." Sophia's mouth dropped open. "But I thought you'd—" "What? Pull strings to get you out of trouble?" Mitchell shook his head. "That's not how this works, Sophia. You drove drunk. You endangered lives. You tried to use my position to intimidate an officer. None of that is acceptable." The look on Sophia's face would have been almost comical if the situation weren't so serious. She clearly hadn't expected her father to side with the police. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice small. "Now you face the consequences," Mitchell replied firmly, "just like anyone else would." He turned to James. "Officer Reeves, could you give us a few minutes alone?" James nodded and stepped away, still processing what had just happened. As he returned to the main area of the station, he noticed all eyes were on him. "Well?" Sergeant Davis asked, unable to contain his curiosity. "How bad is it?" "It's not what I expected," James admitted. "He's actually thanking me for arresting his daughter." The other officers exchanged disbelieving looks. "You're kidding," Officer Torres said. "No way." "He seems to care more about her learning a lesson than getting her out of trouble," James explained. From where they stood, they could see Mitchell talking seriously to Sophia, who now had tears streaming down her face. There was no hint of anger in his posture, just the firm stance of a parent who refused to bail their child out of a situation they'd created themselves. After about 15 minutes, Mitchell emerged from the holding area and approached the officers. "I'd like to talk about bail procedures," he said to Sergeant Davis. "My daughter will be staying here until morning. I want her to experience the full process without any shortcuts." The sergeant looked as surprised as James felt. "That's unusual, sir. Most parents want their kids out as soon as possible." Mitchell smiled slightly. "I'm not most parents, and accountability is an important lesson." As Mitchell and Davis discussed the details, James caught the FBI agent glancing his way with what appeared to be genuine respect. In all his years of imagining what it would be like to arrest someone connected to law enforcement, this outcome had never crossed his mind. Sometimes, James thought, the worst nightmare turns out not to be a nightmare at all. The morning after Sophia's arrest, James woke up feeling uneasy. He'd only managed to grab about 4 hours of sleep, and his dreams had been filled with FBI agents and holding cells. Despite Agent Mitchell's surprising reaction, James couldn't shake the feeling that there would be consequences. He arrived at the station early for his shift, nodding to Officer Torres, who was just finishing up her night duty. "How are you holding up?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "Word about last night has spread through the whole department." "I'm fine," James replied, though the knot in his stomach suggested otherwise. "Just doing my job." "Well, heads up," Torres said, lowering her voice. "Chief Wagner wants to see you in his office as soon as you get in." James's heart sank. The chief rarely got involved in routine DUI arrests. This couldn't be good. "Thanks for the warning," he mumbled, heading toward the coffee machine for some much-needed caffeine before facing whatever was coming. Chief Wagner was a heavy-set man with 30 years on the force and a reputation for protecting his officers as long as they followed the rules. His office door was open when James approached, coffee in hand. "Come in, Reeves," Wagner called, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Close the door behind you." James did as instructed, trying to read the chief's expression. "You wanted to see me, sir?" "I got a call this morning," Wagner began, leaning back in his chair, "from the FBI field office." James felt his mouth go dry. "About last night's arrest?" Wagner nodded slowly. "Agent Mitchell apparently had quite a bit to say about you." He paused, watching James shift uncomfortably in his seat. "He was impressed with your professionalism." James blinked in surprise. "Sir?" "Said you handled the situation exactly as you should have," Wagner continued. "No special treatment, no bending the rules. Said we should be proud to have officers with that kind of integrity." Relief washed over James, but it was short-lived. "That being said," Wagner added, his tone changing, "this situation has created some complications." "What kind of complications, sir?" Wagner sighed. "Politics, Reeves. The mayor's office called too. They're concerned about our relationship with federal agencies, and the district attorney's office is suddenly very interested in this case." "But I followed protocol," James protested. "Even Agent Mitchell agreed." "I know you did," Wagner interrupted, holding up a hand. "And that's why you're not in trouble. But this case is going to be under a microscope now. Every detail, every procedure, it all needs to be perfect." For the next week, James felt like he was walking on eggshells. In the break room, conversations would stop when he entered. Some officers avoided him altogether, while others, like Officer Wilson, seemed almost amused by his predicament. "Man, you really know how to pick 'em," Wilson joked during their shared patrol shift. "Of all the drunk drivers in Oakwood, you had to arrest an FBI princess." "She was breaking the law," James replied stiffly. "Shouldn't matter who her father is." Wilson shrugged. "Maybe not in a perfect world, but in this one, connections matter. You should watch your back." The warnings continued. James heard rumors that the FBI was conducting an audit of the Oakwood Police Department's arrest procedures. Some claimed it was standard practice. Others insisted it was Agent Mitchell's way of finding dirt on the department that had arrested his daughter. Even Sergeant Davis, who had witnessed Mitchell's supportive behavior firsthand, seemed concerned. "Just because he was nice to your face doesn't mean there won't be fallout," Davis cautioned James as they filed paperwork. These federal types play the long game. By the end of the week, James was beginning to regret ever pulling Sophia over. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because the constant tension and whispers were wearing him down. Then came the letter. It arrived at the station addressed to Officer James Reeves, the return address showing the FBI field office. James stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it, his colleagues watching with undisguised curiosity. Inside was a formal letter on FBI letterhead requesting Officer Reeves's presence at Sophia Mitchell's court hearing the following week. Not just a standard witness summons, this was a personal request from Agent Mitchell himself. "What does it mean?" James asked Sergeant Davis, showing him the letter. Davis read it carefully, his frown deepening. "It means this isn't over, kid. Not by a long shot." As James drove home that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the road, he wondered what awaited him at the courthouse. Would Agent Mitchell's supportive attitude hold up in a legal setting, or had the past week's tension been a sign of what was really coming? Only time would tell, and the countdown to Sophia's court date had begun. The county courthouse was busier than usual that Wednesday morning. James arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in his freshly pressed uniform, his badge polished to a shine. He'd barely slept the night before, rehearsing his testimony over and over in his head until the words lost all meaning. "You'll be fine," Sergeant Davis had assured him during their brief meeting that morning. "Just stick to the facts. Tell the truth about what happened that night." Easier said than done when it felt like his entire career hung in the balance. The courthouse hallway was filled with people, lawyers in suits hurrying between rooms, worried families waiting for hearings, court officers keeping everything moving. James found a bench near the courtroom where Sophia's case would be heard and sat down, checking his watch every few minutes. "Officer Reeves." James looked up to see Agent Mitchell standing before him, still in his signature dark suit. He quickly got to his feet. "Agent Mitchell, sir." "Thank you for coming," Mitchell said, extending his hand. They shook, and James noticed the agent seemed tired, with dark circles under his eyes. "I was summoned as a witness," James replied carefully. "I'd have been here anyway." Mitchell nodded. "Of course, but I wanted to make sure you knew I specifically requested your presence." Before James could ask why, the courtroom doors opened. People began filing in, and James lost sight of Mitchell in a crowd. He took a deep breath and followed the stream of people inside. The courtroom was smaller than James had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. He saw Sophia sitting at the defendant's table, wearing a conservative blue dress that made her look younger than her 22 years. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and there was none of the defiance she'd shown the night of her arrest. Agent Mitchell sat directly behind her, his face unreadable. James was directed to a waiting area for witnesses. Through the courtroom doors, he could see people taking their seats, including several officers from his department who had come to watch the proceedings. Officer Wilson gave him a thumbs up from the back row, while Chief Wagner nodded solemnly from his seat near the front. Time seemed to crawl by until finally, a court officer called James's name. He walked to the witness stand, was sworn in, and faced the courtroom. The prosecutor, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s, approached. "Officer Reeves, please tell the court about the events of March 12th involving the defendant, Sophia Mitchell." James recounted the story exactly as it had happened: the red light, the traffic stop, the signs of intoxication, the field sobriety test, and the arrest. His voice grew more confident as he spoke, the familiar details grounding him. "And what was the defendant's blood alcohol level when tested at the station?" the prosecutor asked. "0.14, ma'am, nearly twice the legal limit." "Did the defendant say anything notable during the arrest?" James hesitated, glancing briefly at Agent Mitchell. "She mentioned that her father was an FBI agent. She suggested that I would regret arresting her." "Thank you, Officer Reeves," the prosecutor said, returning to her table. James braced himself for cross-examination. Sophia's defense attorney approached, a young man with an expensive suit and a confident smile. "Officer Reeves," he began, "would you say the defendant was cooperative during the arrest?" "No, sir," James replied honestly. "She was belligerent and attempted to use her father's position to avoid arrest." "And yet you proceeded with the arrest despite knowing her father's position." "I didn't know if her claim was true at the time," James explained. "But even if I had, it wouldn't have changed my actions. She was driving under the influence." The defense attorney looked slightly thrown by the straightforward answer. He asked a few more questions about proper procedure, but it was clear he wasn't finding the angle he wanted. When James was finally dismissed from the stand, he felt drained but relieved. He had told the truth, and the facts were on his side. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. As the judge asked for the defendant's plea, Sophia stood up. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "I'd like to change my plea to guilty." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The defense attorney looked startled, leaning over to whisper urgently to his client. But Sophia shook her head firmly. "I'm guilty of driving under the influence," she continued, "and I take full responsibility for my actions that night." James caught Agent Mitchell's eye across the courtroom. The FBI agent gave him a slight nod that spoke volumes. 6 months had passed since Sophia Mitchell's court hearing. The leaves were turning golden in Oakwood as James pulled his patrol car into the parking lot of Riverside Park. He was no longer the nervous officer who'd feared for his career after arresting an FBI agent's daughter. That experience had changed him in ways he never expected. As James stepped out of his car, he spotted Agent Mitchell waiting by the park bench near the water, just as they'd arranged. Over the months, their unusual connection had evolved into something like mentorship, with occasional calls and meetings when Mitchell was in town. "Officer Reeves," Mitchell greeted him with a handshake. "Thanks for meeting me on your day off." "No problem, sir," James replied, still feeling a touch of formality was appropriate despite their growing friendship. "Though I'm curious about why you wanted to meet in person." They sat on the bench, watching ducks glide across the river's surface. The park was quiet on this weekday morning, just a few joggers and parents with strollers passing by. "I have some news," Mitchell said finally. "2 pieces, actually. First, about Sophia." James hadn't seen Sophia since the court hearing where she'd surprised everyone by pleading guilty. The judge had sentenced her to community service, a hefty fine, and mandatory alcohol counseling. Her license had been suspended for 6 months. "How is she doing?" James asked, genuinely curious. Mitchell smiled, pride evident in his expression. She completed her community service at a local high school, talking to teenagers about the dangers of drunk driving. Turned out she had quite a knack for connecting with kids. He paused. "Actually, she's decided to study counseling when she goes back to college this fall." "That's great," James said, meaning it. "Sounds like she found something positive in all this." "She did, and she asked me to give you this." Mitchell handed James an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. James read it silently. "Officer Reeves, I wanted to thank you for arresting me that night. I know that sounds strange, but it was the wake-up call I needed. I was heading down a bad path, using my dad's position as a shield from consequences. You showed me that real integrity means being accountable for your actions, no matter who you are or who you know. I'm sorry for how I behaved that night, and I'm grateful that you did your job properly. Sophia Mitchell." James folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope, touched by her words. "She's grown up a lot," Mitchell commented. "Sometimes the best lessons come from our worst mistakes." "I'm glad to hear she's doing well," James said. "You mentioned there was other news." Mitchell nodded, his expression turning more serious. "I've been asked to lead a training session at the FBI Academy next month. The topic is integrity in policing and the importance of equal application of the law." He turned to look directly at James. "I'd like you to come speak to the cadets about your experience." James was stunned. "Me? At the FBI Academy?" "Your story is exactly what these young agents need to hear," Mitchell explained. "A young officer who stood his ground and did what was right, even when faced with potential consequences. That's a powerful lesson." James felt a mix of pride and humility wash over him. "I'd be honored, sir." As they continued talking, James reflected on how differently things had turned out from what he'd feared. The night he'd arrested Sophia had seemed like a disaster at the time, the worst possible scenario for a young officer. Instead, it had become a defining moment in his career, one that opened unexpected doors. Word of his FBI Academy invitation spread quickly through the Oakwood Police Department. The same officers who had once warned him about making powerful enemies now looked at him with new respect. Chief Whitener had even hinted at a possible promotion in James's future. "You handled a tough situation with integrity," Whitener had told him. "That's exactly the kind of leadership we need in this department." Later that evening, as James drove past the intersection where he'd first pulled Sophia over, he couldn't help but smile at the irony. What he'd thought was the worst night of his career had actually been the beginning of his best chapter. Sometimes, he realized, doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, even when it seems like a mistake, is the only choice that lets you sleep soundly at night. And in the end, true integrity rarely goes unrecognized. What had started as an officer's worst nightmare had become his proudest achievement.